Okay, welcome to part 4 of this series. I'm going to use Entity Framework to insert data and into a database. We're going to be working in the data access layer. The pros with Entity Framework are there's less custom coding and you can rapidly model your entities and their associations. The cons are large schemas can be a real pain, and there's magic under the covers, or as George W. Bush would say, there's some magickery under these covers here. Okay, so what are we going to do in this video? Well, first off, you're going to have to add the Entity Framework NuGet package to the Data Access Layer project, and then add an empty ADO.NET entity model, and then add entities to that and associations as required. Then you're going to generate a database. And then we're going to modify the Employee VO class from the previous parts of videos in this series, modify the application base, implement the Employee DAO class, and implement unit tests to test our insertions and deletions into the database. Okay, let's get started. Like the introduction said, this video picks up where the video number 3 left off, and in video 3 I added tests to the test project to the overall solution. Today we're going to add some real functionality. We're going to actually start sticking stuff into a database, and the approach that this video takes uses the Entity Framework. Okay, so Entity Framework is like object-relational mapping. The benefits, which were mentioned in the introduction, is, it's kind of convenient to use, right? The cons are, you got to operate within the confines of how Microsoft envisions this thing working, right? And there's some magic underneath the covers that you got to kind of be aware of. But you can make it work in a complex multi-layer architecture. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Now, the first thing you got to do to get started is you need to add the Entity Framework to the Data Access Layer. Now, just clicking on the Data Access Layer project is not going to help you. All right. So before I do that, let me just say I'm using Visual Studio 2014 again, and then we're going to use a database, a real no-kidding database. Microsoft SQL Server 2014. This is SQL Server Management Studio, and here's my databases. There are no employee training database, just to give you a quick look. And notice that in my Data Access Layer references, there are no references to the Entity Framework yet. So we gotta add the Entity Framework package. To do that, we're going to say NuGet Package Manager, bring up the Package Manager console. Once that initializes, the very first thing you want to do is you want to click this drop down box and make sure that the project, that where you're sticking that package, is going into the project you think it's going into. So Data Access Layer. Okay, now let's do find package at the prompt, and this will list the packages that are available from our designated NuGet source. And we see we have Entity Framework 613. So down at the prompt again, type install package, Entity Framework, hit enter. And once this thing finishes installing the package, we'll take a look and see what the state of affairs are. All right, now we go, it's done. Now you'll notice in the references for the Data Access Layer, we have Entity Framework and Entity Framework Server references added to our references, and a couple other things. And we have an app config file, which it'll pop up here in a second. Okay, and it'll have an Entity Framework section added to it. Okay, close that, and we have a packages config. So, and it's got the Entity Framework package. So you don't usually have to mess around with those too much anymore. Now we create our model, and this is the model first approach, where we create the Entity Framework model, and then we use the model to generate the database. So at this point, the database does not exist in the database. So the way I like to organize my data access layer is I'm going to create model folder. So add a new folder. Add new folder, right? And I'm going to call it models. So there might be more than one model in your project, and you just want to make sure that you got some place to put them. Okay. Now, on that models folder, right click and click add new item. You could probably put this in a subfolder as well, but for this I'm not going to do it. So I'm going to add, so you select the data on the left hand side here, and then click ADO.NET Entity Data Model, and I'm going to call my model Employee Training Model. So when you get the Entity Data Model wizard pop up, click Empty Entity Framework Designer Model and hit Finish. Now, what's going to show is the designer surface. Okay, so this is your design platform, canvas, I guess you'd call it, right? There's a couple different ways to add entities. You can right click and you can say add new entity, and we can certainly do one that way, or you can just drag it over from the toolbox. So I'm going to drag an entity over from the toolbox to start and double click on it. I'm going to call this employee. Make sure you spelled it right. Employee. Now it comes with an ID property already. So I'm going to add new scalar properties. Employee number. Add another one. First name. And you know, your typical properties for an employee. Middle name. And there might be more that you think of, but I'm going to keep them fairly, you know, not too many for this demo. Last name. So we're just creating our first entity at this point, adding properties to it, and I'll show you how to make sure that the properties of the type that you know, they need to be. So let's say date of birth. Date of birth. Add new scalar property, hire date. Okay, and I think that looks pretty good. So I'm gonna move this entity over here and extend it out this way a little bit. I have an ID property, employee number property, first name, middle name, last name, date of birth, hire date. Now, so select a property. Come over here to the right hand side, you got a properties window. So here, if you see my cursor, it's highlighted right there. There's a property selected. Okay, so the property that we're talking about right now is the employee ID, so just select that. And if you see right here, we have you've got different sections right in this properties window. So I'm looking for the type, and the type is right there. int32, it's stored generated pattern is identity. So what identity means is when you when you do an insertion into the database table, the primary key, which is in this case is the ID because it has a little key right there next to it, it's going to automatically increment, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay. Now, so what I'm going to do is make sure that these other ones are what I think. Now for employee number, the default type for these scalar types is string, okay, which is good for employee number. I'm okay with string. They're all nullable, not nullable, which means that they can't be null, and that's okay too for this demo. First name is a string, middle name is a string. Where am I seeing that at? Well, again, right down here in the type. Date of birth, however, is a string, and I don't want that to be a string, so I'm going to select date time. So I just, there's a drop down right here, so I just select the date time for the date of birth property, and now I select hire date property, and I'm going to select date time as well, just like that. Okay, now at this point you can save your diagram. All right, Now I'm going to add another entity using the right click on the diagram model. So there we go. Entity, I'm going to call this training. Entity sets training, that's fine. Key, create key property, ID, type int 32. Okay. Now we start again, right? Right click. I'm just going to add a small little handful. Title. We know these properties, or these scalar type properties, are string by default, so I'm not going to go check them. Add new scalar property, description. And add new scalar property, date. Now the date, excuse me, I'm going to make sure that that is date time, right? Date time, just like that. Alrighty, save the diagram. Now I'm going to right click and I'm going to add an association between these two entities. And because I only have two, it does a pretty good job at guessing what I'm trying to do. And if there's any doubt, you can look down here and read. It says the employee can have many instances of training, which is kind of what we want. They can go to many trainings. And training can have one instance of an employee. And that's fine too. Okay, so for this demo, I'm not going to put too much thought into it. That's okay. Hit OK. It creates the association. Now, if you wanted to edit the association, right, or delete it, let's see what the properties are here. The association set name. Okay, you can change it. I can leave it just like that, though. That's fine. Now, save the diagram. Okay, at this point, we've got entity framework added to the project, to the DataAccessLayer project, right? We've created a new folder for models. We've added a new diagram, right? And we have two entities. Now it's time to generate the database, okay? So right click on the canvas, on the diagram, and select generate database from model. Now you're going to have to, if you've never done this before, right, or if you don't have any connections established, we're going to have to click on new connection at this point. And if you're not sure, I suppose you could type localhost right here, right? But I'm going to go to my management studio, and I'm going to see right there that's the name of my database, Rick Miller 49B2. Right, that's the name of my server. So I'm going to select Rick Miller 49B2. I'm going to use Windows authentication, and then I'm going to type in the name of the database that I want to create. Employee training. So make sure you've got Microsoft SQL Server right up here, data source. You got the right server and Windows authentication, and then select or enter a database name. And I've got employee training for this example. Now hit OK. Now what happens is it'll say, oh, let me see here. Oh, employee training, Rick Miller. Well, hang on one second. Let me troubleshoot this problem. Well, let me just try that again here. So server name, Rick Miller 49B2. All right, Windows authentication. And then let's see what they got for databases here. We got master DB. No, we don't want master or any of those. We want employee training. Okay, and hit, let's check out advanced, make sure everything's fine. You shouldn't have to set anything here, so we'll hit OK, and then hit OK. And we'll let that spin for a second and see what happens. Now, okay, so this is what you're supposed to get, right? You're supposed to get this little message that says the database employee training does not exist, or you do not have permission to see it. Would you like to attempt to create it? And let's just hit yes. Okay, now this is normal. So you got this database wizard. We have the connection that we're going to use is, in my case, right, your server name will be different. But if you're following along with this tutorial, you'll have your server name dot the database name employee training, in this case, dot database owner is DBO. And then you have a connection string. I recommend leaving it just like that. And then you got this little box down here that's checked in this lower left-hand corner. You see my halo. Save connection strings in app config as employee training model container. Now that name is going to be important. We're going to use that when we actually create a database context. So hit next. Now what this does is it'll create the SQL script that's going to be used to then actually create the database tables in the database. So at this point, the database exists. And I'm going to just click over here real fast to the MS SQL server, and I'm going to expand. And you can see now that the database is, there's a new database, employee training, right? There's no tables in it, right? Well, there's only the system tables and the file tables. So let's go back to MSS or Visual Studio, back to the database, generate database wizard. Scroll down through the database script and make sure that everything looks hinky-dinky. All right, so we got to create table for employees. And then, check your script, hit finish. Now this doesn't create the tables. What this does is it creates the script, and over here in your, you can see my little spinny thing. It's over here on the right. Let me wait till that script actually pops up there. There it goes. So now let me minimize or bring that down, close that window. Here's my Visual Studio window. Now here's the script, okay? So again, you go through here and check the script. You generally do not need to make any modifications to it. When you're ready, you're feeling froggy, hit execute. That little green triangle up in the upper left-hand corner. It's going to pop up a connect window. You want to click the down arrow. If you're connecting locally, which I am, I'm going to select that database, my server, right? In my case, my server. The database name is default. Hit connect. And then, in a blink of an eye, right? You'll see this message down here in the lower left-hand corner says query executed successfully. And then in this window, commands executed successfully. Now, at this point, you can close the script. It says, just save any changes to the database diagram. And I'm going to pop over while Visual Studio is thinking. And now we can take a look at our tables and we can hit refresh. Now we've got our DBO employees table and we have DBO trainings table. At this point, we are ready to proceed with implementing our DAO capability, where we're actually going to insert into the database and delete objects from the database. Okay. So let's get started. I'm going to return to Visual Studio. I'm going to close, well, let me just save this, Control Save, before I close that diagram. If you just hit the X, it'll ask you to save it anyway. I love it when Visual Studio just sits there thinking. All right. So, all right, there we go. Now, close that diagram. Okay, now, I'm going to minimize models, the models folder, and I'm going to create a new folder in the data access. So add new folder. I'm going to call this DAO. Right now, in the DAO folder, I'm going to create a new item. It's going to be just a regular class. Okay, and I'm going to call it Employee DAO. All right, Employee DAO. It's a new class. It's in my the DAO folder inside the DataAccessLayer. Hit add. All right, there we go. Now it pops up there. Okie dokie. Okay, so our employee DAO, I'm going to use this employee DAO. So the way I'm going to do it is I'm not going to fight with Visual Studio, and I'm not going to fight with the entity framework, right? But what I do want to do is I want to provide kind of an abstraction between the other application layers in my project and the need to know anything about entity framework, right? So really, I just want to call it, I'm just going to grab a DAO from the access layer and say, hey, here's an employee value object, stick it in the database, right? And because I'm using entity framework, which is already an object relational mapping thing, right? There's all kinds of functionality that's going on, and there's already. So if we go to the models and we extend it, we see that we have, if you extend this employee training model TT, we already have two entities. We have an employee entity, right? And it's practically a value object, right? It's a partial class, and it has everything that, you know, pretty much your employee VO is going to have, right? But I don't want to mess with this class, because what happens is whenever you update your model, right? You update the model, this stuff is auto-generated. Okay, so this stuff's going to be wiped out every time you make a change to that model and you update the code. I don't want to mess with that stuff. I want that stuff to be updatable and whatever. That doesn't mean I'm not going to have to change some of my stuff if I change the model, of course, because if I'm depending on the model to insert stuff into the database and my code depends on that, then I'm going to have to make changes. But I'm going to have a class called Employee DAO, right, that is going to allow me to just say, hey, create. Now, it's going to have a create method, it's going to have a delete method, may have an update method, your basic CRUD methods, but I can add any method I want. You know, I can go grab a DAO by ID. I can grab an employee by ID. So what is going to happen is in my infrastructure layer, and I'm sorry that this stuff comes at you so fast, in my infrastructure layer, I have an employee VO. I'm going to modify this to add the same features, like for example, it needs an ID property, it needs an employee number property, it needs a date of birth property and a hire date property. So I need to modify it, okay? And then in the employee DAO is where the employee entity that's being utilized by the framework, the entity framework, and is going to be then, it meets the employee VO. So I'm going to from the edge or from the interface of the data access layer, I'm going to insist on using the employee DAO, sending it employee value objects, but in the employee DAO, it's going to use the entity framework to stick stuff into the database. That's how I'm taming the madness of entity framework, right? Because if you just knock out a project and you put this stuff all over the place, then you find that there's too much interbreeding amongst the entity framework and all the other object layers in your project. Okay, so where to get started? I could start in the employee VO, but I'm not. I'm going to start in the employee DAO, and also too, along the way, we're going to make a change to the application base. But before we can use any of this stuff, right, we're going to have to add some using statements here. So using infrastructure. Well, let me just make sure that I am, where am I at? I'm in the employee DAO. Okay. So I have this. Okay, so what I'm mumbling to myself about right there is whenever I type infrastructure .vo, right? I'm not seeing it. You see this red, right? I'm not seeing it. So that means that I need to go to my references section and make sure that I add a reference, right? And projects, right? So I need to add the infrastructure layer to my data access layer, which is fine, right? I need to reference that project. Hit OK, and that red should go away here in a second. make sure I spelled it right. So using infrastructure, there we go, right? VO, and using infrastructure layer.common. Okay. Now, so public, I'm going to make this class public, right? Public. So even though, you know, Visual Studio creates a bunch of stuff for you, application based, you still got to type a lot of code, right? You got to know what you're doing. All right. So what this says is, hey, no arguments given for that corresponds to the required formal parameter declaring type of application based type, right? That's because I haven't implemented the constructor yet. So let me do that. Public Employee Dao, right? And this is the constructor. And then base, base, right? Now the system dot reflection dot method base dot get current method, right? Dot, and then that is a method dot declaring type. There we go. Open brace, closing brace. That's our constructor for now, right? We might add more stuff to it later on. Now I want to create two methods. Public. I want this method to return an employee VO. And the name of this method is going to be create employee. Now it's going to take the argument is going to take an object of the type employee VO. So just thinking out loud here, you know, like since this VO is going to ferry information between layers of the application, I'm just going to say return VO, put it out of its misery right there. Because the employee VO is going to ferry information back and forth across layers of our project. When I created employee VO, you know, the database assigns the primary key, and I need that primary key in order to figure out, like, you know, what object I'm dealing with, right, in my application. Especially when I have a collection of objects and I want to make sure I'm you know, accessing the correct one. But when I create the employee VO, let's say I'm in my presentation layer and I have a user interface and I fill in all the blanks for create new employee, you know, first name, employee number, last name, that kind of stuff, and I hit, you know, create, it's going to go to the business object layer, which is going to go to the data access layer, and it's going to pass that VO, you know, that's been populated with that front end information to this method, right? But it doesn't have a primary key yet. So I need to stick it in the database and go grab it from the database to grab its primary key and return that value object, okay, to the system. So we have that primary key available and any other information that we need. All right, so this is pretty straightforward. What I'm going to do is we have practically everything that we need. I need to access using DataAccessLayer dot models, because I'm going to be using, you know, I'm in the data access layer here, right? So I'm just creating a class that's going to access this stuff down here, right? So that I don't have to use any of this stuff anywhere else in parts of my other project layers. So so that's why I need that. So let's just start typing here. You'll see what I'm doing. So using let's say var db equals new employee. Now see, we have employee training model container, so we're going to create a new one of those, and then we're just going to, first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an employee entity, because we're going to what we're doing is we're going to say, hey, use this employee, you know, this is our connection to the database essentially, right? So we're going to say, hey, using this database model, employee training model container, create an entity, And the only entities that the framework knows about, the entity framework, are these entities here, employee and training, right? So I'm going to create an employee entity, and I'm going to populate it with the values that are located here. Now, at this point, okay, you'll see what happens here in a second, because my employee VO is not fully fleshed out, so you're going to need to return to that and actually add more properties, and that's a piece of cake. So I'll show you how to do that. But once you get started here, you're just going to say VAR employee, right? Let me make sure I got all my includes here. Oh, I'm sorry. VAR employee. Okay, so see right here, we got this employee type. Boom. Okay, and then I'm not going to do like a constructor call. I'm going to do these brackets, and then I can just set properties. So employee number equals VO. Here's where we come into our first problem, right? VO does not have an employee number yet, right? So we have to open up our employee VO in our infrastructure layer. This is where, you know, having a good structure to your project, you know, makes it easy to find stuff. You're like, oh, I need this object, or I need this class from my solution. Where is it at? Well, if you got it organized, right, you can find it. So public int ID, open, close, get, set. Okay, and there's our ID property. Public string, employee number, get, set. So we got first name, middle name, last name, and now I'm going to put public, date, time, date of birth, get, set. Okay. And then one final property, public, hire date. Oh, sorry, date time, hire date, open brace, closing brace, get, set. So all my properties are there. Now what I need to do is I need to add, you know, I need to modify these constructors. So I'm going to say int ID string, and no, I'll do them in the order. So I'll say int ID string, employee number, like that, employee number, string first name, string middle name, string last name, date, time, date of birth, and date, time, hire date, like that. Okay, so now I'm going to go up here and modify this one, because now it's all out of whack, right? So I'm going to say 0. That's my default value, right? If I just create a employee VO, that's going to be my default value. And then my employee ID, I'll put 1, 2, 3, 4, just like that. Or maybe I should put something like 9999, or some, you know, incredible long number that I'm never going to use, right? That way I know it's you know, it's I want to say crap. Okay, and then and just for the hire date, I'm just going to say date time dot now, and date time dot now. So okay, those are bogus values, right? That's just like, oh, I'm creating a new employee, boom, automatically comes into existence with these values. The ID is 0, right? Because if we wanted to stick this in the database for testing purposes, right, then we don't know what the primary key is, so we don't care, right? We'll just make it 0. Now we got to come down to our next constructor and finish this off. So ID, so capital ID equals ID. Okay, employee number, capital employee number equals employee number, like that. First name, middle name, last name, that's fine. And then date of birth, right, equals date of birth. And hire date, capital hire date equals lowercase hire date. Bada bing, bada boom, we're smoking cigarettes. Now, that should do it for the employee VO. So now we can say, well, let me at this point, let me just comment this out. Well, let's see. Well, I'll build the infrastructure project. Infrastructure layer build. Okay. Just make sure that it's refreshed. All right, so one build succeeded. So now here I should be able to say VO.employee number. So now it shows up, okay? Where am I at now? I'm back in my employee DAO class. So I assign the employee number, first name. So, right, employee number. Oh, sorry, hang on. This is a comma, right? These aren't line endings here. I'm actually setting, properties on this new employee entity type. So that's a comma at the end, not a semicolon. That's why it's giving me a hard time. So employee number equals VO.employee number, and then first name equals VO.first name. Okay, and this is pretty just easy to do. Middle name equals VO.middle name, comma. Last name equals VO.last name, comma. And then date of birth equals VO.date of birth, and hire date equals VO.hire date, like that. And then leave that one like that, right? And then put a semicolon at the end of that thing down there. Control save. Okay, so we have this, so we created this employee entity and we populated its values with the values that are coming in this employee create employee method. So now what we have to do is we have to stick it in to the database. So the way that you do it is db, right? Because I'm still in this using statement, right? And I've got my object here, db, db dot add, right? Employees. So that's the object that we have. That's our employees, how do you say, table representation, right? So stick this in the employees table dot add. It's actually a collection, right? The entity framework is caching this stuff, right? I mean, I'm putting this stuff into a collection. So add, it's a DB set. You can see right here, that's the name of it, right? It's a DB set, or that's the type. So now I'm going to add the employee. I'm adding this employee right here, right? Employee. And then DB. Now, if you don't do this, it's not going to actually persist. DB dot save changes. Shabam, right? Now, how do we commence to getting our thing that we just inserted into the database out? So we're going to create a query. Query, var query equals, and we're going to use some link from b and db.employees. Okay, return where b.employee number. Okay, for testing purposes, this is perfectly fine, right? So I just stuck one in here. And if it was a real employee, it would have a unique, right? So that would be perhaps a constraint that we want to have in our business rules, employee number. All right, so I'm going to say we're b employee number equals, right, VO dot employee number. Oops, I did a return there. Dot employee number. Okay, return. And then select B, semicolon. And then when I'm going to use the query, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say vo.id equals query. All right, equals, hang on one second. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the ID of the VO, right? So v equals query, back to what I was doing, dot first, okay, dot ID. Oh, it's lowercase ID, right? So go grab that guy by this employee number from B. If you're not used to link, it's a little strange, right? But I'm doing a comparison here where B employee number equals employee number. And then here I'm just saying, hey, look, even if I do grab more than one, just get the first one and stick it back in there. Because I'm going to make sure in my code that I don't have, for testing purposes, I might have more than one, right? But in reality, we're going to make sure that that employee number is unique. Okay. Oh, and at that point we return. Now, okay, so then we return the VO. So this is the using statement. You know, we have logging. We have logging. So let's actually be a little prudent here and do this. I'm going to wrap this using in a try catch block. Okay, and I'm going to catch any exceptions that occur. Catch exception ex open brace closing brace, and I'm going to say, now here's where we run into a little bit of an issue with our application base. In the video number 2, I tested it using an employee VO object, which was in the same namespace, well, not the same exact namespace, but in the same project. So long story short, we're going to have to make a modification to our application base, but it's perfectly within the, you know, the spirit of this architecture to do this. So go to the common folder in your infrastructure layer, open up the application base class, and what happens is if we try to access this logger without having nlog in our project, right? And I want to isolate nlog to the infrastructure layer project, we're going to have to add some public properties on, or protected properties, right, on this application base. So these are all not properties, these are methods, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say public or protected void, and I'm just going to say log debug string s. I'm going to actually make two of these methods. So log debug, and then I'm going to access this. I'm just going to use that logger property, the log property, and say log.debug s, like that, right? Now I'm going to speed this up a little bit, and I'm going to make log debug. Let's do another version of this. Let's do log debug with the object. Now we're overloading these methods, and I'm going to say o.toString. This is going to pay dividends here in the very near future. And then now I'm just going to grab these and make copies of these. So we got our log debug, and I'm going to say log trace, log trace. So now we're making modifications to the application base class, which was created in video number 2 of this series. And we're just making it a little bit better to use. Control V. Now I'm going to say log warning. Okay. Log warning. Log warn. Let's do log warn. Okay. And then log warn down here. Log warn. Control save. And then one more time for log error, which is really the one that I need, but I might as well just do them all, right, while I'm at it. Log error. Log error. And then one more time. This is the last one. As far as I know, that's the last one. All right, so application base has been duly modified. Now what I want to do is I want to rebuild, or I just want to build the infrastructure layer since I made changes to that thing. And then I'm going to move back, so that's fast. I want to move back to my employee DAO, and then in my catch block, all right, I'm in my create employee. If for some strange reason you're just joining this video at this point, I'm in my create employee method in my employee DAO class, and I'm in my try catch block. And now what I need to do here is say log warn or log error. So I have a log error method now, right? Log error. And then I can just feed EX because EX is an object, right? And then I'm calling a toString on it. Boom. All right. So now I have the ability to create an employee. And in fact, at this point, we need to make a test. Okay? That's how we're going to figure out if this thing works or not. So we're going to have to create a test. Now, let's go down. This won't take too long. Let's go down to our, and we'll come back to this employee DAO object or this DAO class and finish it out. But we're going to create a test. Now, we're in our DataAccessLayer. Okay, so here's our tests project down here. And let me, this is our DataAccessLayer project. This is our infrastructure layer project. This is our tests project. So in our tests project, in order to get Entity Framework so the test is like an executable thing, right? Test is an executable thing. So it needs, in order for it to work, it needs to know the connection string to the database. It needs to have the connection string to the database. And in order to do that, we're going to take this app config file with all the information that we need, and we're going to copy to the tests project. Paste. All right. But in order for this app config says, hey, look, we have Entity Framework section, right? And so in order for this connection to work to the database, we are also going to have to import the Entity Framework here. So we're going to have to run our package manager one more time. Okay, package manager console. We're going to make sure that the tests project is selected, and we're going to execute. I don't know if we can actually just hit the up arrow key. Yeah, we can. Make sure test project is selected up here. Okay, tests. And then run it one more time and install the Entity Framework package in the test project. All right. Now that we've done that, let's check our test project references, and we do in fact have Entity Framework and Entity Framework SQL Server. Let's build everything, make sure everything's running. Let's build everything. Just make sure we're not messing ourselves up here. Okay. You know, when you're doing this type of programming, there are so many moving parts that it's rare that you can just like focus on one layer and build it out without kind of moving around different layers. And you kind of don't want to build everything at the same time anyway. You kind of want to make sure that things are working as you go. Now we got to create a test. So in the DataAccessLayer, I'm going to create a new folder. Okay, a new folder. Okay, for our test, and so what are we testing? Well, we're going to test our, well, let me see. I guess we could say add a new folder, DAOs. Just like that, right? Okay. Well, let me see. Maybe we could, we might be able to, well, I don't know. Yeah, DAO. We'll do DAO, right? We're testing DAOs really is what we're doing. So, okay, that's fine. So let me close the employee DAO class. And so we have the employee, we have the DAO folder for our data access, and in our test project we have a DataAccessLayer folder and a DAO folder. So I'm going to say add new item unit test whenever it pops up here. Okay, so code. Oh well, let's select test here. That's better. Unit test. Now I'm going to call it employee DAO test. Okay. And I'm going to click add, and that's fine. Okie dokie. So there's a lot of stuff that gets put in here, and for right now we can ignore it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just write over top of this method here, right? And I'm going to say insert employee test. Insert employee test. Now, generally speaking, philosophically for these tests, if you insert something into the data, you want to kind of leave the state of the database, right? Otherwise, you're going to screw yourself. Sorry for my French. You're going to mess yourself up if you insert stuff into the database and then in between test runs, you don't either completely recreate the database or leave the database in the state it was prior to executing the tests. And this can be a little tricky because if your if your tests fail at certain points, then your database may be left in a inconsistent state, right? Which then, if you rerun the tests again, they may fail because data is in the database that's not expected to be there. There's more records than you counted on, or their data isn't there that you expect to be there. So this is where, and I'm going to do this in a separate video, it's handy to actually have a separate set of scripts that allow you to delete the database and recreate the database on the fly every time you run tests, right? So as part of your build process, there should be like a build activity that lets you create drop the database, recreate the database, insert all the test data that's required. But I'm not going to go into that right now. That would take another hour or two. So for this insert employee test, I'm just simply going to come up here and I'm going to add my using statements, okay, that I need in order to gain access to what I need to get to. So the first thing that we need to do is make sure that our references are all there, and we are accessing the business object layer, data access layer. That looks good. All right. So up in our using statements, we have using infrastructure layer .vo. Right. Now, if we wanted to use logging down here, we certainly could do that. Might as well, right? Using infrastructure layer .common. Right, because we might use static logger. I don't know if I'll do it in this video, but you could. And now we're going to say using DataAccessLayer.dao, right? And I think that's about it. Notice we're not using the data access layer models. So back down to our test, and simply what we're going to do is we're going to create an instance of VO, so employee VO. Employee VO. VO equals new employee VO. Now that just creates an employee VO with those default values. And what default values, you're asking? What are you talking about, man? Come on. You're freaking me out here. Let's go back to the employee VO class. And down here in our constructor, this is the VO. We create a default. We call the constructor. The ID is 0. The employee number is 99999. I should probably copy that value. The name is John Wayne Doe. Date time now, right? And then and that's it. So those are the default values. So when if I don't specifically set values for an employee DAO, that's what the VO values are. Now I'm going to create an instance, employee DAO. Just like that. Okay. At this point, okay, I want to preserve something. So in order for my test to work, I need to make sure that when I stick, so right now my VO ID, right, is 0, and I'm going to say original ID equals VO dot ID, right? So the original ID would be 0, and I know that for a fact at this point. When I insert it into the database, okay, what I do is I go VO equals DAO dot create employee VO, right? Like that. Now I want to assert dot R not equal, right? Assert R not equal, and it says the first one, what's not expected? Well, I don't expect it to be the original value, so I'm going to say original, okay? And the actual is VO dot ID at this point. Now, I'm going to put something down here that should be here, but I haven't implemented it yet, and I'm going to say DAO dot delete employee, right? VO dot ID. Now, if you're a test first person, this test is going to fail until I implement the DAO employee ID. But I'm just going to comment that out because that's going to be like a reminder. It says, hey, do this. So save. Well, at this point, this is when you cross your fingers and go, man, I sure hope all this stuff works right. Right? But really the point is we're gonna come here to our database now. We're in our employees table, and we're going to select edit top 200 rows. And there should be nothing there. So I'm going to close that. Now I'm going to build everything. I have a test called insert employee test. Okay, so the build succeeded. So let's come up here to test, open up the test explorer, and it shows I have, so obviously there's a insert employee test. That's the one I want to test right now, employee constructor test. I'm just going to select this one, run selected test. Now things can go horribly wrong, but it looks like it went okay. Okay, so I got that. Now, what's the state of affairs? Let's go to the database. That test executed, which means I created an employee VO, I put it into the database, and I got it from the database, right? Because in my create employee method, it goes, grabs it from the database and returns it. Let's do an edit, or let's select top 200 rows. And there we go. So there is, so now I could run that test multiple times, right? Because what happens is I'm just going to grab the first, employee number at this point. There's no logic in my business object layer or any layer that's limiting, or that's making sure that those employee numbers are unique. I could also put a constraint on that column on the database to make sure that nothing gets inserted. That would be another line of defense, right? But it's a business rule that has yet to be implemented, if you understand what I'm saying. So there's my employee record has been inserted into the database. Now, if you bear with me, I will implement the delete employee method. All right. And then we can check and make sure that if we run this test, okay, if we run this test, then every time we insert the employee, we do the test, we make sure everything works, and then immediately, boom, we delete the employee from the database. Then our database is in the same state it was before we ran the test. All right. So I'm going to delete this record. Okay. Let me just select the record and hit delete. Yeah. Okay. So delete it. Now back to Visual Studio. Close that test window. Open up, that's our Employee DAO test. I want to go back to our Employee DAO in our data access layer, and I want to create another method. Public, and this can be void. Void delete employee. Yeah, OYEE, I cannot. So int, my fingers are a little flubby today. ID. So all we're going to pass in is the ID of the thing that we want to delete. Okay, and then using, again, var db. In fact, we could probably copy it from up there, right? var db. Okay, equals new employee training model container. Okay, open brace, closing brace. And now all we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to grab, we're going to say employee, right? Employee, so those employees are entities that we deal with, right? In the DAO layer, right? Only in the DAO layer, those entity framework employee entities are what we're going to use. So employee, okay, equals, cast this to employee, okay, and then db dot employees, okay, dot where, okay, okay, where, this is link, right? Oh, it gives me a little bit of a stumbling block. B is in b dot id, okay, oh, id lowercase, equals ID. So this is the ID I'm talking about right there. ID. Okay. And then space first, like that. So so what happens is the entity framework deletes objects, right? So we're going to we want to delete this thing. So if the employee exists in the database, we're going to grab the database where the ID equals that ID. Okay, and then we're going to delete that object. So the way that we do that is we say db dot employees dot remove, okay, and then employee, just like that. Now, in order for that to make sure it works, we got to go db dot save changes. Right? Don't forget save changes. And quite honestly, we want to make sure that all this stuff is in a try catch block for logging. Trust me, man, you know, logging is going to save your friggin' hind end when you're doing this development. I'm just doing it general exceptions here, right? Catching everything. Probably not the best coding methodology, but so log log error, right? EX, just like that. Okay. So now we have this delete employee. Now let's go back to employee DAO test. Actually, let's build the data access layer. Okay, that makes sure that we have that DLL, fresh DLL ready to roll. And of course I missed a open brace, so let's see. Oh, okay. So try catch. Oh, all right, let's just come here. Missing one of those. Control save. Hey, that's par for the course. Let's build that again. Build. Okie dokie. Looks okay to me. All right. So let's go back to our DAO test. Uncomment this out. Now, our database has nothing in it. See, presto. Just like Rocky and Bullwinkle. Hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat. Nothing up my sleeve. Right? There's nothing in the database. Let me just make sure. Let's do that top 200. Nothing's there. Let me build everything. Okay. Build solution. That'll make sure the test gets built. The test will get built. Everything gets built. Like if you run the test, right? So let's go test. Windows, Test Explorer. All right. Let's run this test again. Repeat last run. So now what we're going to do is we're going to run this test. It's going to insert the employee into the database, and it's going to immediately delete the employee if all goes well. Looks like it did. Looks like it's finished, right? So let's go to the database and see. All right. So let's right-click on the employees. Okay. And edit top 200 rows. There's nothing there. So the employee object got inserted, and then it got deleted as part of the test. That's just my way of doing it, right? So for this video, it's gone on long enough. You can now go in and create, and probably in another video, I will show you how to start adding, training, right? As we get into doing the other layers, I will flesh out the DAO layer to start dealing with training. And then, we're going to have to modify the employee VO to handle training, a collection of training records, right? So an employee might take multiple training over the course of their career or their stint at a company. And then every time they take training, they want to record the title, the date they took it. And, maybe as we go, we might even change what properties employee has and training has, right? And that's the flexibility of this architecture and doing things this way. This is just the recap. We use the entity framework model first to create a new database. Now, if we make changes, we're going to be updating the database, right? So as I go through this particular branch of the project, we'll have to go through that stuff, right? So that'll be video number 5. This is video 4. That'll be the next video. The next big branch will be doing this entire project, not with entity framework, but hand coding all the DAOs, by hand using SQL statements. And there is a benefit to doing it that way. Okay. Besides being it's a pain in the butt, but it's maximum flexibility. Can you say that? Maximum flexibility. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a great day.